Your body is changing. This is not happening to you. This is revealing something profound that the Buddha understood 25 centuries ago. Tonight, you will discover how 7 authentic Buddhist teachings transform the experience of aging into something you never expected. Not philosophy, not theory, actual practices that shift how your mind relates to every physical change happening right now. The Buddha taught that aging becomes suffering only when we resist what is already unfolding. When we stop resisting, something remarkable happens. The fear dissolves. The anxiety quiets. What remains is peace with exactly what is. These 7 stories come from the oldest Buddhist texts, the Pali Canon, the Therigatha, authentic records preserved for over 2,000 years. Each one shows a different person discovering this same truth. An elderly couple learning their minds need not age with their bodies. A woman whose famous beauty faded completely, yet found something far more valuable. A father and daughter who faced death itself with such presence that even their final moments became teachings. By the time you reach the end of this journey, your relationship with your changing body will have shifted. Not because anything external changed, because you remembered something you already know, but have forgotten. Let the world outside continue. Here, we have 3 hours to remember together what the Buddha taught about growing older with wisdom instead of fear. In a small village near the city of Sumsumaragiri, there lived an elderly couple who had grown old together. Their names were Nakulapita and Nakulamata, and by the time this story takes place, they had already spent decades as devoted followers of the Buddha's teachings. But devotion to the teachings and freedom from suffering are not always the same thing. Nakulapita had reached that stage of life when the body makes itself known in ways it never did before. His joints ached when he rose in the morning. His back protested when he sat too long. Simple tasks that used to take moments now required careful planning and rest. Some days were better than others, but increasingly, the difficult days outnumbered the easy ones. What troubled him most was not the physical discomfort itself, but the cascade of fears that accompanied each new limitation. When he couldn't lift something he used to carry easily, he worried about becoming a burden. When illness kept him in bed, he feared he might not recover. When he looked at his wife, he wondered what would happen to her if he died first. Beneath all these specific fears lay a deeper anxiety, the feeling that his very self was dissolving along with his body's strength. His wife Nakulamata was also aging, also experiencing her own physical changes, but somehow she carried it differently. She moved through her days with a quality of acceptance that puzzled him. Not resignation, not giving up, something else entirely, a kind of peace he couldn't quite access. One morning, after a particularly difficult night of pain and sleeplessness, Nakulapita made a decision. The Buddha was staying nearby at a grove called Besakala, and Nakulapita decided he needed to speak with him directly. His wife accompanied him on the journey, which took longer than it would have years before, with more rest stops and careful attention to each step. When they finally reached the grove, Nakulapita felt a mixture of relief and embarrassment. Here he was, an old man complaining about old age to someone who surely had more important matters to address. But the Buddha's face showed only warmth and genuine interest as they approached and offered their respects. Nakulapita sat down heavily, his body grateful for the rest. For a moment he wasn't sure how to begin, but then the words simply came. "Venerable Sir, I am old now. My body is aged, burdened with years, advanced in life, come to the last stage. I am afflicted in body and often ill. It is only rarely that I get to see you, and I fear I may not have many more opportunities." He paused, gathering courage. "I am afraid, teacher, not just of death itself, but of what my decline means for those I love. My wife is also growing older. If something happens to me, how will she manage? And I feel like I'm watching myself disappear, piece by piece, as my body fails." The Buddha looked at him with such compassion that Nakulapita felt tears spring to his eyes. But the Buddha's next words were not what he expected. Not sympathy, not platitudes, but something far more practical. "Nakulapita, this body of yours is indeed afflicted, sick, burdened. Whoever would claim this body is healthy, even for a moment, displays nothing but foolishness. The body will age. The body will sicken. The body will eventually cease. This is its nature, and no amount of wishing will change this fundamental truth." Nakulapita felt his heart sink. This was exactly what he feared. Confirmation that his worst anxieties were justified. But the Buddha wasn't finished. However, the Buddha continued, his voice carrying absolute certainty. "Though your body is afflicted, you should train yourself so that your mind is not afflicted along with it. The body will age. This is beyond your control. But the mind need not age in the same way. The body will experience pain. This is inevitable. But suffering is something else entirely, and suffering is not inevitable at all." Something shifted in the space between them. Nakulapita leaned forward, sensing he was about to hear something essential. His wife Nakulamata, sitting quietly beside him, seemed to already understand, nodding slightly as if recognizing something she had discovered on her own. The Buddha looked directly at Nakulapita with piercing kindness. "Tell me, when your knee aches, is that ache your mind or your knee?" "My knee, Venerable Sir," Nakulapita answered immediately. "And when your back is stiff, is that stiffness your awareness or your spine? My spine, teacher. And when you feel pain in your body, where is the pain felt? Nakulapita paused, suddenly uncertain. In my body, venerable sir, but I am also aware of the pain. So, is the pain in my body or in my awareness? The Buddha smiled. This is the beginning of wisdom. The body experiences its conditions: age, sickness, pain, weakness. The mind knows these conditions, but the mind that knows pain is not itself in pain. The awareness that observes aging is not itself aging. The consciousness that watches the body's decline does not itself decline. He let this settle before continuing. You have spent your whole life identifying completely with this body. When the body was strong, you thought, I am strong. When the body was healthy, you thought, I am healthy. Now that the body weakens, you naturally think, I am weak. I am failing. But what if all of these thoughts are based on a fundamental misunderstanding? Nakulapita felt something loosening in his chest, like a knot beginning to untie. What misunderstanding, venerable sir? The misunderstanding that you are this body. Consider this carefully. The body you had as a child is completely different from the body you have now. Every cell has been replaced many times over. Which of these bodies is you? Or are you something that has been aware of all these changes without itself changing? The grove seemed extraordinarily quiet. Even the birds had fallen silent. Nakulamata reached over and gently touched her husband's hand, and he realized she had tears running down her weathered cheeks, not tears of sadness, but recognition, relief. The Buddha continued, his voice gentle but unwavering. The body is not yours to keep. It never was. It is made of borrowed elements: earth, water, fire, air, that will return to their sources. It arises due to conditions, exists for a time, and ceases when conditions change. To grasp at it, to identify with it, to think, this is me, this is mine, this is myself, this is the root of your suffering. But venerable sir, Nakulapita asked, his voice trembling, if I'm not this body, then what am I? When the body dies, what remains? The Buddha's eyes were infinitely kind. You are asking the wrong question. The question is not, what am I? But rather, is there any fixed, permanent thing that can truly be called I? Look at your experience right now. Your body changes. Your feelings change from pleasant to unpleasant to neutral. Your perceptions change. Depending on what you're experiencing, your thoughts arise and pass away like clouds. Where in all of this is there anything permanent enough to be called a fixed self? Nakulapita sat very still, looking inward at his actual experience, rather than his ideas about it. The Buddha was right. Everything he could observe was in flux. His breathing changed from moment to moment. Sensations arose and passed. Thoughts came and went. Even the sense of being someone aging and worried was just another thought that appeared and disappeared. But if there's no permanent self, Nakulapita said slowly, then what am I afraid of losing? What is it that fears death? Exactly, the Buddha said warmly. When you look closely at this fear, what do you find? Not a solid, permanent I that is threatened, but rather a habit of mind, a pattern of clinging that has been running for so long it feels real. But habits can be seen through, and what is seen clearly loses its power to cause suffering. He leaned forward slightly. Here is what you should practice, Nakulapita. When your body experiences pain, notice it clearly without adding the thought, I am in pain. Simply observe. There is pain in the body. When your body feels weak, notice it without concluding, I am weak. Simply observe. There is weakness in the body. Create this small space between what the body experiences and how you interpret it. At first, this will feel strange, unnatural even, but gradually, as you practice this awareness, something remarkable will happen. The body will continue aging, but the mind will discover a peace that doesn't depend on the body's condition. The body will experience pain, but the mind will not be tormented by it. The body will eventually die, but the mind will meet that death without terror. Nakulamata spoke for the first time, her voice clear and steady. Venerable Sir, I have been practicing something similar without knowing quite what I was doing. When I notice my husband worrying about what will happen to me, I try to remind him that I am not as fragile as he fears. I too am aging, but I can still work with my hands, still think clearly, still care for myself. His worry comes from love, but also from not seeing clearly. The Buddha nodded with appreciation. This is wisdom, Nakulamata. You see that your husband's worry is not truly protecting you. It is only creating suffering in his mind. This clear seeing is exactly what I'm teaching. He turned back to Nakulapita. Your wife is showing you something important. Your worry about her is based on an image in your mind, but that image is not reality. Meanwhile, the real person sitting beside you has her own strength, her own clarity, her own capacity to meet whatever comes. Nakulapita looked at his wife with fresh eyes. She smiled at him, and he saw something he'd somehow missed. Yes, she was old, her hair white, her face lined with years, but there was a brightness in her eyes, a groundedness in her presence that spoke of someone who had already made peace with what he was still fighting. You have both been practitioners of the Dharma for many years, the Buddha said warmly. According to those who remember such things, you have been each other's parents and relations across many lifetimes. Now you have the opportunity to support each other in a new way, not by trying to prevent each other's suffering, which is impossible, but by helping each other see clearly the nature of suffering and the path beyond it. After the Buddha finished speaking, Nakulapita sat quietly, integrating what he'd heard. He noticed that his knee still ached. The teaching hadn't magically healed his body, but something had shifted in how he related to that ache. It was there, present, real, but somehow it didn't feel as heavy or threatening as before. Still, questions remained. How to actually practice this moment by moment? The Buddha seemed to sense this. What I've shared is the essence of the teaching, but you may benefit from speaking with one of my senior disciples. Sariputta is staying nearby, and he has great skill in explaining these subtleties. After thanking the Buddha with deep bows, Nakulapita and Nakulamata made their way to where Sariputta was sitting under a large tree. When the elder monk finished teaching a small group, Nakulapita approached and recounted his conversation. Sariputta listened with complete attention. When Nakulapita finished, he nodded slowly. The Blessed One has given you the teaching of how the body can be afflicted while the mind remains unafflicted. Let me help you understand this more completely. He gestured for them to sit closer. Consider the 5 aggregates that make up what we call a person: form, feeling, perception, mental formations, and consciousness. Right now, you identify with all of these. When your body hurts, you say, "I hurt." When you feel sad, you say, "I am sad." This is the afflicted mind, one that has completely merged with these changing phenomena. But there is another way, Sariputta continued. You can learn to observe these aggregates without identifying with them. The body is experienced, but you recognize this body is not me, not mine, not myself. Feelings arise, but you recognize these feelings are not me, not mine, not myself. Nakulapita furrowed his brow. But Venerable Sir, isn't saying, "Not me, not mine," just another thought. How does that help? Sariputta smiled. You are quite right to question this. Yes, at first these are just words, but they point your attention toward investigation rather than assumption. When you say, "This body is not me," you're not making a new belief. You're actually looking to see if it's true. You're investigating your actual experience. He demonstrated with a gesture toward his own body. Right now, there is stiffness in this back. If I automatically think I am stiff, the mind contracts around that sensation. But if I notice there is stiffness, or there is the sensation called stiffness being known by awareness, something interesting happens. The sensation remains the same, but the mental suffering dissolves. Why? Because I've stopped taking it personally. Nakulamata leaned forward. This is what I've been doing without knowing the formal teaching. When my hands ache from working, I notice them as hands that ache, rather than as my aching hands. It's a subtle difference, but it changes everything. Precisely, Sariputta said. You've discovered through your own practice what the teaching describes. This is the difference between the afflicted body and the unafflicted mind. The body ages, sickens, experiences pain. These are its natural conditions. The mind, when it doesn't cling to the body as self, remains spacious, peaceful, unshaken. He looked at both of them with deep kindness. You have grown old in years, but you don't have to grow old in wisdom. In fact, these very challenges, the aching joints, the declining strength, the awareness of mortality, can become your greatest teachers if you meet them with clear awareness rather than resistance. Nakulapita felt something releasing in his chest. I think I'm beginning to understand. Not completely, but enough to start practicing differently. When the pain comes, I can try to notice it as simply pain rather than as my pain, as proof that I am falling apart. That is exactly right, Sariputta confirmed. Don't expect perfection. You've spent decades building the habit of identifying with the body. But each time you catch it, each time you create that small space between sensation and identification, you weaken the habit's grip. Over time, that space becomes more natural, more available, more reliable. As Nakulapita and Nakulamata walked slowly home together later that day, they moved with a different quality. The journey was no easier on their bodies, no less taxing, but something had fundamentally shifted. The pain was still there, but it wasn't a problem in the same way. The aging was still happening, but it wasn't a catastrophe. Nakulamata spoke quietly as they rested by the side of the road. All this time, I thought I was helping you by trying to reassure you that I would be fine. But what you really needed was what the Buddha offered, not reassurance about the future, but clear seeing about the present. Nakulapita took her hand, feeling the familiar texture of her skin, weathered by years of living. And I thought I was protecting you by worrying. But worry isn't protection. It's just suffering happening in advance of any actual problem. The Buddha showed me that aging doesn't have to mean the mind ages along with the body. They sat together in comfortable silence as the afternoon sun filtered through the trees. Both of them were still old. Both would continue to age. Eventually, both would die. None of these facts had changed. But their relationship to these facts had transformed completely, and that transformation made all the difference between suffering and peace. There was once a woman named Ambapali who lived in the city of Vesali, and for years her name was spoken with a kind of reverence, usually reserved for royalty or religious figures. But Ambapali was neither queen nor saint, at least not at first. She was a courtesan, famous throughout the region for a beauty so striking that kings would compete for an evening in her presence. Her eyes, people said, were like polished jewels that caught the light. Her hair fell in waves of black so deep and glossy, it reminded observers of a bee's wing in sunlight. Her skin was flawless, her movements graceful, her voice like music. Men of wealth and power would travel great distances just to see her, and they paid extravagant sums for the privilege of her company. Amberpali herself was not naive about her circumstances. She understood that her beauty was both her fortune and her prison. The same qualities that brought her wealth and status were also impermanent. She knew this intellectually, even if she didn't yet understand it, in the deeper way she would come to know later. She saw other courtesans age and watched how quickly the crowds moved on to younger faces. But when you are young and beautiful, and the world revolves around you, it's easy to think your own situation might somehow be different. Then one day, the Buddha came to Vaisali. Amberpali heard about this teacher who spoke of liberation, of freedom from suffering, of a path that had nothing to do with youth or beauty or wealth. Something in her stirred, a curiosity perhaps, or a longing she hadn't known was there. She arranged to meet him, expecting perhaps that he would be like other men who came to see her, dazzled by her appearance, eager for her attention. But when the Buddha looked at her, he didn't see a beautiful woman or a famous courtesan. He saw a person carrying the same fundamental suffering as everyone else, trapped in the same cycles of grasping and aversion, capable of the same profound awakening. His gaze was neither attracted nor repelled. It was simply clear, seeing her as she actually was, rather than as an image or an object. That clarity shook something loose in Amberpali. For the first time in years, perhaps in her entire life, she felt truly seen, not as a body to be desired, not as a possession to be acquired, but as a being with the potential for complete freedom. The Buddha taught her about the nature of all conditioned things, how everything that arises must also pass away. He taught her about the body and how identifying with it creates endless suffering. He taught her that clinging to what cannot be kept is the root of all unhappiness. And most importantly, he taught her that liberation was possible, that freedom from this cycle of clinging and suffering was available to anyone willing to walk the path. Amberpali listened with her entire being. The teachings landed in her heart with the force of recognition, not as new information, but as a truth she had somehow always known, but never articulated. Within days, she made a decision that shocked everyone who knew her. She gave away her considerable wealth, donated her famous mango grove to the Buddhist community, and asked to be ordained as a nun. The transformation was immediate and total. The elaborate hairstyles were replaced by a shaved head. The luxurious silks gave way to simple robes. The woman who had been adorned and decorated and displayed became someone who owned nothing but a bowl and the clothes on her back. And in that simplicity, she found a peace she had never known amid all the luxury. But becoming a nun was just the beginning. The real work was internal, learning to see clearly, to observe without grasping, to let go of the deeply ingrained habits of self-identification. Amberpali practiced meditation with the same intensity she had once applied to perfecting her appearance. She studied the teachings, sat in silence, and gradually began to experience directly what the Buddha had described. Years passed, then decades, and as they did, something began happening to Ambapali's body that would have once filled her with horror. She was aging. The hair that had been compared to a bee's wing began to grey, then turned completely white, coarse, like hemp fibre. The eyes that had sparkled like jewels grew dim. The skin that had been so smooth and flawless began to wrinkle and sag. The body that kings had competed to possess became bent and frail. The breasts that had been full and firm now hanging loose. The limbs that had moved with such grace now stiff and uncertain. But here is what's remarkable. Ambapali watched all of this happen with neither grief nor fear. She didn't lament the loss of her beauty or rage against the changes in her body. Instead, she saw her aging as a profound teaching unfolding in real time, her own body becoming a demonstration of what the Buddha had taught about the impermanent nature of all things. By this time, Ambapali had achieved what in Buddhism is called full awakening, complete liberation from suffering, the end of all grasping and delusion. From this place of freedom, she began to compose verses, describing her transformation, not as poetry meant to impress, but as precise observations of truth, as teachings that could help others see what she had seen. She would sit in meditation, examining her aging body with the same clarity she had learned to apply to her mind, and the verses would arise naturally, each one following the same pattern, a memory of how things were, an observation of how things are now, and the recognition that this change is exactly what the Buddha taught about. Her verses began with her hair. She remembered how it had once been fragrant and black, glossy as a bee's wing, how people would comment on its beauty, how much care she had devoted to maintaining it. Now it was grey and coarse, like hemp, brittle and thin. Not otherwise is the word of the truthful one, she would say at the end of each verse. Meaning, this change is exactly what the Buddha taught would happen, and it has happened just as he said. She described her forehead, once smooth as a polished bowl, now creased with wrinkles. Her eyebrows, once like crescents, carefully drawn, now scraggly and drooping. Her eyes, which had been compared to the petals of a blue lotus, bright and flashing, now dull and weak, their beauty completely gone. She spoke of her ears, once adorned with beautiful rings and ornaments, now drooping. Her nose, once delicate and lovely, now wrinkled like a withered fruit. Her teeth, which had gleamed like jasmine buds, now broken and discolored. Her voice, once sweet as a cuckoo's song in the forest, now cracked and faltering. She described her neck, once smooth and unlined, now bent and creased. Her arms, which had been like rounded gold, now weak as the wood of a withered tree. Her hands, which had been so graceful, now trembling and covered with veins. Her breasts, once full and firm and uplifted, now hanging loose like empty water bags. She spoke of her body, which had been smooth and golden, like a sheet of gold, now covered with fine wrinkles, like those on an old elephant's skin. Her thighs, which had been like an elephant's trunk, now thin and weak. Her calves, once shapely and smooth, now shrunken. Her feet, which had been adorned with rings and had stepped so gracefully, now swollen and cracked. And after each detailed, unflinching observation, she would repeat the same refrain: "This is exactly what the Buddha taught. This body is subject to change. Everything that comes together must come apart. All that is beautiful must decay. Nothing can be held on to. This is not a tragedy. This is simply the nature of all conditioned things." What makes Ambapali's verses so extraordinary is not just their honesty, but the complete absence of complaint in them. She wasn't mourning her lost beauty. She wasn't bitter about aging. She wasn't trying to cling to the past or deny the present. She was simply observing, clearly and precisely, what was happening and recognizing it as the truth she had been taught and had come to understand completely. For Ambapali, the aging of her body was not an obstacle to her spiritual practice. It was the practice itself. Every wrinkle was a teaching on impermanence. Every grey hair was a reminder not to grasp at what cannot be kept. Every change in her physical form was proof of what the Buddha had taught about the nature of all things. This is a radically different approach to aging than what most of us take. Usually, we relate to aging as a problem to be solved, or at least postponed. We use creams and treatments, we dye our hair, we do whatever we can to maintain the appearance of youth. And there's nothing inherently wrong with taking care of our bodies, but Ambapali was pointing to something deeper. She was showing that the body can be a gateway to liberation rather than a trap. By observing its changes clearly, without adding stories about what those changes mean about our worth or our future, we can see directly into the nature of reality itself. The body becomes a teacher, and aging becomes a continuous lesson in letting go. Consider what Ambapali was actually doing with these verses. She was taking what most people experience as a source of suffering, the loss of youth and beauty, and transforming it into medicine. Not by denying the changes or pretending they didn't matter, but by seeing them so clearly that their impermanent nature became obvious and undeniable. She had spent the first part of her life building an identity around her beauty. That beauty had brought her wealth, fame, and the attention of powerful men. It had also brought her suffering, because she was trapped by it, defined by it, limited by it. When she became a nun and began practicing the Buddha's teachings, she started to loosen her grip on that identity. And now, in old age, She was watching that identity dissolve completely as her body changed in ways that made her previous beauty unrecognizable. But here's what's crucial to understand. Amberpali didn't lose herself when she lost her beauty. She discovered that there had never been a fixed self to lose in the first place. The beauty had been temporary, yes, but so was everything else. Her thoughts, her feelings, her perceptions, even her sense of being a separate someone who was aging. All of it was in constant flux, arising and passing, moment by moment. This is what the Buddha taught as the three characteristics of all conditioned existence: impermanence, unsatisfactoriness, and not self. Everything changes. Nothing can provide lasting satisfaction, and there's no fixed, permanent essence that we can call me or mine. Amberpali's verses are a direct demonstration of these truths, using her own body as the teaching tool. What she was offering in these verses was not just an account of her own aging, but a practice that anyone could use. Look clearly at the body, she was saying. Don't look away from the changes. Don't pretend they're not happening, but also don't make them mean more than they do. They're just changes, just the nature of physical form playing itself out according to natural law. When she said, "Not otherwise is the word of the truthful one," after each observation, she was pointing to a profound trust in the teachings. The Buddha had said the body would age and decay, that all conditioned things are impermanent, that clinging to them brings suffering. And now she was seeing this truth manifested in her own flesh, confirming through direct experience what she had been taught. There's a deep peace in this kind of seeing. When you stop fighting against the nature of things, when you stop demanding that your body remain young, or that circumstances stay the same, when you simply observe what is actually happening without all the mental elaboration, something relaxes. The suffering that comes from resistance dissolves, and what remains is a clear awareness that doesn't depend on the body's condition. Amberpali had discovered that she was not diminished by her body's aging. Her wisdom, her peace, her fundamental freedom, none of these had anything to do with whether her hair was black or grey, whether her skin was smooth or wrinkled, whether her body was desired or ignored. These qualities arose from understanding, from clear seeing, from the liberation that comes when grasping finally ceases. In fact, you could say that Amberpali was more beautiful in old age than she had ever been in youth, though it was a beauty of an entirely different order. The beauty of youth is the beauty of a flower in bloom, lovely, certainly, but temporary and dependent on conditions. The beauty Amberpali manifested in her later years was the beauty of wisdom, of freedom, of a heart that had learned to release its grip on everything that passes. Her verses show us that aging doesn't have to be a slow tragedy of loss. It can instead be a deepening understanding, a continuous reminder of truths we need to learn, a gradual stripping away of everything superficial until only what's essential remains. The body changes. this is guaranteed. But the awareness that knows the body, the consciousness that observes the changes, this can grow clearer and more stable even as the body weakens. What Ambapali was teaching through her example is that we don't have to wait until we're old to practice this kind of clear seeing. Every day, the body is changing in small ways. We can learn to notice these changes without the usual layer of judgment and story. The grey hair that appears, the line that forms, the energy that isn't quite what it was, these can all be moments of practice, opportunities to observe impermanence directly and to let go a little more of our identification with this temporary form. Ambapali spent the first decades of her life believing she was her beauty, and that belief brought her both pleasure and pain. She spent the middle decades of her life learning to see through that belief, discovering a freedom that didn't depend on physical appearance. And she spent her final years demonstrating that freedom through her verses, using the very body that was decaying as proof of the teachings that had liberated her. In the end, Ambapali's story is not really about aging at all. It's about awakening. It's about how suffering arises from grasping at what cannot be held, and how freedom comes from seeing clearly the impermanent nature of all things. Her body was her classroom, and the lessons she learned there, she offered freely to anyone who would listen. The courtesan who had once been prized for her physical beauty became a teacher whose wisdom continues to illuminate the path 25 centuries later. Her hair grayed, her eyes dimmed, her body bent and weakened, and through it all, she remained free, observing each change with clarity and confirming with each observation that the truth she had been taught was indeed the truth she was living. Not otherwise is the word of the truthful one. In 8th century China, there lived a man named Pang who might have been wealthy and comfortable if he had wanted to be. He had been born into a good family, had received an education, and possessed the skills and connections to make his way in the world. But somewhere along the way, Pang encountered the teachings of Zen Buddhism, and that encounter changed everything about how he understood life, how he wanted to spend his time, and what actually mattered. Instead of pursuing wealth and status, Pang loaded all his possessions and money onto a boat, rowed out to the middle of a river, and sank the entire cargo. When people asked why he didn't at least give the money away to help others, he replied that possessions only complicate life, and he didn't want to complicate anyone else's life either. This was the kind of person Pang was, someone who had seen through the usual motivations so completely that his actions seemed almost absurd to those still caught in conventional thinking. What made Pang's story even more unusual was that his entire family shared his realization. His wife, whose name is lost to history, practiced with the same depth and clarity as her husband. Their son and their daughter, Ling Zhao, both grew up immersed in the Dharma, not as a set of beliefs to memorize, but as a living reality to embody, moment by moment. The family would travel together through China, supporting themselves by making and selling simple bamboo utensils, engaging in Dharma discussions wherever they went, and living with a lightness and humor that comes only from genuine freedom. By the time Pang reached old age, the family had settled in a cave on Mount Deer Gate. They owned almost nothing, needed almost nothing, and yet somehow lacked nothing. Their days were simple: some work, some meditation, some conversation, some silence. They lived so seamlessly with the natural flow of things that there was no sense of effort or striving, just a continuous presence with whatever the moment brought. One morning, Pang woke up and knew something with absolute certainty. It was time for him to die. This wasn't a guess or a worry or a fear. It was simply clear information arising from deep awareness of his body and its cycles. He didn't resist this knowledge, didn't try to bargain with it, didn't fall into anxiety about what it meant. He observed it the same way he might observe the sun rising or the seasons changing, as a natural occurrence, requiring no commentary. He told his daughter Lingzhao that he planned to die at noon. She didn't cry or protest or try to talk him out of it. Instead, she asked him to let her know when the sun reached its highest point so she could be there with him. This was the kind of family they were. Death was not a taboo subject, not something to be feared and avoided, but simply another transition to be met with awareness and presence. As noon approached, Pang sat down in meditation posture, settled his mind, and prepared to let go of this life with the same ease with which he had let go of everything else. He had lived fully, practiced deeply, and now it was time for this particular expression of consciousness to dissolve back into the larger movement of life and death that encompasses all things. But just as he was settling into his final meditation, his daughter Lingzhao suddenly called out from outside the cave, "Father, Father, come quickly. There's a solar eclipse. You must see this." Now, Pang was a man who had dedicated his life to seeing clearly, to being present with reality as it actually is. And a solar eclipse is indeed a rare and remarkable occurrence, a moment when the ordinary patterns of sun and moon align in unexpected ways. So despite being moments away from his planned death, Pang got up from his meditation seat and went to look. When he stepped outside, there was no eclipse. The sun shone, as it always did at noon, bright and unobscured. Pang turned back toward the cave, perhaps to question his daughter about her announcement, but then he stopped. Inside the cave, in the exact spot where he had been sitting, his daughter Lingzhao had taken his place. She sat in perfect meditation posture, completely still, and as he watched, she died, just like that, instantly, effortlessly, without drama or struggle or any sign of distress. She had tricked him, had gotten him to move from his seat so she could die first, and she had done it with a playfulness that was entirely consistent with how the family had lived. Pang stood there looking at his daughter's body, and then he began to laugh. Not a bitter laugh, not a laugh covering pain, but genuine delight at the trick she had pulled, at her timing, at the way she had demonstrated complete freedom even in the moment of death. She had shown that true practice isn't about following a plan or maintaining control. It's about being so present and unattached that even death can become an expression of spontaneous wisdom. He called to his wife, who came from another part of the cave where she had been working. She looked at their daughter's body, saw what had happened, and understood immediately. There was grief, certainly. Love doesn't disappear just because you understand impermanence. But the grief was clean, uncomplicated by resistance or the belief that something wrong had occurred. Their daughter had lived completely, practiced completely, and now had died completely. What else could parents who truly understood the Dharma want for their child? Pang decided to delay his own death by 7 days to properly honor Ling Zhao, to arrange for her body, and to complete the rituals that help the living process loss. This too was remarkable. The same clarity that told him it was time to die also told him it was time to wait. There was no rigid attachment to his original plan. No sense that he had to die at noon because he had said he would. The practice he had cultivated his whole life gave him this flexibility, this responsiveness to what was actually needed in each moment. During those 7 days, friends and students came to offer condolences and to pay respects to Ling Zhao. Pang spoke with them about impermanence, about presence, about his daughter's profound realization. He didn't minimize the reality of death or pretend it was something other than it was, but he also didn't add unnecessary suffering to the natural experience of loss. One visitor asked him how he could remain so composed, so present, so apparently unshaken by his daughter's death. Pang's response pointed directly to the heart of his understanding. He said that when you truly see the nature of all things, how they arise due to conditions, exist for a time, and pass away when conditions change, then death is no longer something separate from life, no longer an enemy to be feared, or a tragedy to be mourned as if it were unnatural. He explained that most people suffer not because of death itself, but because of how they relate to death. They resist it, deny it, pretend it won't happen, or when it does happen, they tell themselves stories about how it shouldn't have, or that it's wrong, or that they can't bear it. But death, like birth, like aging, like illness, is simply part of the package of having a body, of being a temporary pattern in the larger flow of life. This doesn't mean you can't feel sadness when someone dies. Pang missed his daughter, her quick wit, her dedication to practice, her ability to surprise him even after decades of living together. But missing someone and suffering about missing them are two different things. The first is a natural human response to loss. The second is what happens when we add resistance and stories, and demands that reality be other than it is. On the 7th day after Ling Zhao's death, Pang sat down again in meditation. This time there were no interruptions, no tricks, no delays. He settled into stillness, and then, just as naturally as breathing out, he died. His wife found him later, sitting in perfect posture, having let go of this life with the same ease and clarity with which he had lived it. But the story doesn't end there. When the wife saw that her husband had died, she made arrangements for his body, informed those who needed to know, and then went to their son with the news. The son heard that both his sister and father had died, and according to the records, he simply walked off into the mountains and was never seen again, the understanding being that he too had died soon after, in his own time and way. And the wife, after making sure everything was properly handled, she went to say goodbye to an old friend. The friend asked where she was going, and the wife said simply that her husband and children had already left, so now it was her turn to go. She left the friend's house, and within a short time, she too had died. The entire family, within the span of perhaps a month, had died, not through tragedy or illness or violence, but through what appears to have been a kind of natural completion. They had lived together in the Dharma, practiced together in the Dharma, and when the time came, they died together in the Dharma, each in their own way, each demonstrating complete freedom and presence even in that final moment. This story has been told and retold in Zen circles for over 1,000 years, and it continues to challenge and inspire practitioners today. It's challenging because it presents a relationship with death that's so different from what most of us experience. For most people, death is the ultimate enemy, the thing we spend our lives trying to avoid thinking about, the fear that lurks beneath so many of our choices and anxieties. But for the Pang family, death was just another moment, another opportunity to be present, another chance to demonstrate the freedom that comes from genuinely letting go. They didn't romanticize death or seek it out. They lived fully and completely, right up until the end. But they also didn't cling to life, didn't grasp at existence, didn't try to make something permanent out of what is fundamentally temporary. What enabled them to live and die this way was not some special technique or secret practice, but rather a deep, embodied understanding of impermanence. They had looked clearly at the nature of all things and seen that nothing lasts, nothing can be held onto, nothing remains the same, even from moment to moment. And rather than finding this depressing or nihilistic, they found it liberating. When you truly understand that everything is temporary, you stop wasting energy trying to make things permanent. When you see that death is inevitable, you stop pretending you have unlimited time, and you show up more fully for the life you actually have. When you recognize that control is an illusion, you stop exhausting yourself trying to manage outcomes, and instead learn to respond skillfully to whatever arises. The humor in this story is also significant. Ling Zhao's trick wasn't disrespectful or morbid. It was an expression of the playfulness that comes from genuine freedom. When you're not burdened by fear, when you're not constantly defending a fragile sense of self, when you've truly let go of needing things to be a particular way, then lightness and humor become natural expressions of that freedom. Pang's laughter when he saw what his daughter had done wasn't inappropriate. It was the perfect response. She had demonstrated complete mastery, complete presence, complete freedom from fear, and she had done it in a way that was unmistakably her. How could a father who truly understood the Dharma respond to such a demonstration with anything but delight? This doesn't mean we should all aspire to die the way the Pang family died. The specifics of their story belong to them, to their particular time and circumstances and level of realization. But what we can learn from them is something about how to live, how to be present with impermanence, how to hold our plans lightly, how to meet each moment with awareness rather than resistance. Most of us will not know the day and hour of our death the way Pang seemed to. Most of us will not have the option of simply sitting down and letting go when the time comes. Death will come to us in its own way, in its own time, perhaps suddenly, perhaps after a long illness, perhaps peacefully, perhaps with struggle. But what we can practice now, while we're still alive, is the same quality of presence and non-attachment that the Pang family embodied. We can practice noticing when we're grasping, when we're trying to make permanent what is temporary, when we're resisting the natural flow of change. We can practice letting go in small ways, of opinions, of preferences, of the need to be right or in control, so that the muscle of letting go becomes stronger and more familiar. We can practice being with uncertainty rather than constantly seeking security. We can practice appreciating what's here now rather than always reaching for what's next. We can practice meeting difficulty with presence rather than resistance. And in practicing these things, we prepare ourselves not just for death, but for a more awake, more free, more fully lived life right now. The Pang family lived in a cave with almost no possessions, but they were rich in ways that matter far more than material wealth. They were rich in presence, in clarity, in freedom from fear. They were rich in their relationships with each other, in their shared understanding, in their ability to meet whatever came with equanimity and even humor. And when death came, they met it the same way they had met everything else, with awareness, with acceptance, with complete trust in the natural unfolding of things. This is what becomes possible when practice goes deep enough, when understanding moves from the intellectual to the embodied, when the teachings about impermanence and non-self stop being ideas and become lived reality. Death doesn't disappear. It remains as inevitable as ever. But the fear of death can dissolve, and what remains is simply presence with what is, moment by moment, breath by breath, all the way to the end and beyond. Among the Buddha's disciples, there was a monk named Mahakassapa who practiced with a particular intensity that set him apart, even in a community of dedicated practitioners. He was known for his commitment to what were called the austere practices, sleeping under trees rather than in shelters, eating only what was offered in his alms bowl, without selecting or refusing, wearing robes made from discarded cloth found in charnel grounds. These were not requirements of monastic life, but voluntary disciplines that Mahakassapa took on as a way of cutting through comfort and complacency. Mahakassapa had joined the community when he was already middle-aged, bringing with him a seriousness of purpose that never wavered. He wasn't trying to impress anyone with his austerity. In fact, he often practiced alone in remote places, away from the main body of monks. His discipline came from a genuine recognition that attachment to comfort and ease can subtly undermine practice, and he wanted to give the Dharma every possible advantage in his own heart. The Buddha respected Mahakassapa deeply, not because austerity is inherently superior to other approaches, but because Mahakassapa's practice was authentic, rooted in wisdom rather than in self-punishment or spiritual ambition. He knew when to push and when to rest, when strictness served the Dharma and when it would only feed the ego's need to be special. This discrimination, this wisdom in practice, is what made him truly exemplary. As the years passed, both Mahakassapa and the Buddha grew older. By the time this story takes place, the Buddha was in his final years, his body showing the effects of decades of traveling, teaching, and living simply. He still taught with the same clarity, still radiated the same profound peace, but physically he was slowing down, needing more rest, experiencing various ailments that come with an aging body. One day, Mahakassapa approached the Buddha with an unusual request. He had noticed that the Buddha's robe was old and worn, the cloth thin from years of use and washing. Mahakassapa's own robe, while made from discarded cloth as his practice required, was newer and in better condition. He offered to exchange robes with the Buddha, to give the Buddha his better robe, and take the Buddha's worn one for himself. This was not a small gesture. In the monastic community, a monk's robe was one of only a few possessions allowed, and to offer your robe to another was to offer something essential, something you depended on daily for protection from the elements and for maintaining the dignity of the monastic form. But Mahakassapa's offer went deeper than simple generosity. He was seeing that the Buddha's body needed care, needed whatever small comfort a better robe might provide. He was also recognizing something profound about the nature of spiritual community, that caring for the teacher is not about subordination or worship, but about practical support, about ensuring that the one who carries the teachings can continue to share them effectively. The Buddha looked at Mahakassapa for a long moment, understanding everything that was being offered in this simple exchange of cloth. He could have declined, could have insisted that he was fine with his old robe, that a teacher shouldn't accept such things from students. But instead, he agreed to the exchange. In accepting Mahakassapa's offer, the Buddha was demonstrating something crucial about aging and about spiritual maturity. He was showing that there's no shame in needing support, no loss of dignity in accepting help when it's genuinely offered. The role of teacher doesn't mean pretending to be invulnerable or never needing anything from anyone. It means being real about the human condition while still pointing toward freedom from suffering. The exchange of robes became symbolic of something larger, a kind of transmission, an acknowledgement that Mahakassapa understood the teachings deeply enough to support and even, in some ways, to carry them forward. When Mahakassapa put on the Buddha's old robe, he was taking on a responsibility, accepting a role that would become even more crucial after the Buddha's death. This wasn't about power or status. In fact, Mahakassapa continued his austere practice just as before, still sleeping under trees, still eating from his bowl without preference. But something had shifted in how the community saw him and in how he understood his own responsibility to the Sangha, the community of practitioners that the Buddha had established. As the Buddha's health continued to decline, Mahakassapa found himself serving in subtle ways, making sure the Buddha had adequate shelter, ensuring others didn't overwhelm him with questions when he needed rest, creating the conditions for the Buddha to teach effectively, even as his physical energy waned. This is what mature practice looks like, not just personal attainment, but using your understanding to benefit others, especially those who have given you so much. When the Buddha finally died at age 80, the entire community was shaken. For decades, he had been the living embodiment of the teachings, the one who could answer questions, resolve disputes, provide guidance on subtle points of practice. Now that presence was gone, and what remained was the community itself, and whatever understanding had been transmitted during those years of living and practicing together. Mahakassapa was not present when the Buddha died. He was traveling some distance away. When he heard the news, he made his way to where the Buddha's body was being honored, and he arrived with a group of monks just as the funeral rites were about to begin. The records say that the Buddha's funeral pyre, which had resisted all attempts to light it, spontaneously ignited when Mahakassapa paid his respects, bowing to his teacher's feet one final time. In the weeks and months following the Buddha's death, a question began to emerge within the community. How would the teachings be preserved? The Buddha had never written anything down. Everything he had taught over 45 years existed only in the memories of those who had heard him, in the practices they had learned directly from him, in the understanding they had developed through his guidance. Some monks began adding their own interpretations to the teachings, claiming the Buddha had said things he hadn't said or had meant something different from what he'd actually taught. Others began relaxing the discipline, arguing that without the Buddha's physical presence, some of the rules no longer needed to be followed strictly. There was a real danger that within a generation or two, the original teachings would become so diluted and distorted that they would lose their transformative power. It was Mahakassapa who recognized this danger most clearly and who decided to act. despite being one of the oldest monks in the community, despite having every reason to retire to quiet practice, after years of intensive discipline, he stepped forward to organize what would become known as the First Buddhist Council. He understood that this was necessary, that someone had to take responsibility for gathering the teachings, for creating a reliable record, while those who had actually heard the Buddha were still alive. And he understood that his age, far from being a disqualification, was actually an asset. He had the authority that came from decades of respected practice, the wisdom to navigate the inevitable disagreements, and the determination to see the project through. Mahakassapa decided that the council would include 500 monks, all of whom had achieved full awakening, all of whom had extensive knowledge of the teachings and the monastic discipline. He chose a cave at Rajagaha, where they could meet during the rainy season, when travel was difficult and monks typically stayed in one place anyway. He secured the patronage of King Ajatasattu to provide the necessary support for such a large gathering. The council itself was a remarkable feat of organization and memory. Mahakassapa invited Upali, who had been the Buddha's attendant in matters of discipline, to recite all the rules and regulations that governed monastic life when each rule had been established, under what circumstances, what exceptions applied, what the underlying principle was. This became what would be called the Vinaya, the entire framework of monastic discipline. Then he called on Ananda, who had been the Buddha's personal attendant for the last 25 years of his life, to recite all the discourses he had heard the Buddha give, the teachings on meditation, on ethics, on wisdom, on the nature of suffering, and the path to its end. Ananda had an exceptional memory and had heard more of the Buddha's teachings than perhaps anyone else. His recitation became the foundation of what would be called the suttas, the collected discourses. After each recitation, the entire assembly would discuss it, question it, confirm it, make sure it was accurate and complete. If even one of the 500 had a different memory or a question about the accuracy, they would work through it until they reached consensus. This wasn't about majority vote or one person's authority. It was about collective memory, about cross-checking and verification, about preserving the teachings as accurately as humanly possible. The process took months. Mahakassapa presided over all of it, maintaining the focus and discipline needed for such an undertaking, resolving disputes, keeping the work moving forward. It required not just knowledge of the teachings, but also patience, diplomatic skill, and unwavering commitment to the larger purpose beyond personal preference or pride. What Mahakassapa was demonstrating through this massive effort was a truth about aging that often goes unrecognized, that elder years can be a time of enormous contribution, not despite age, but because of it. The qualities that come with age and practice, wisdom, perspective, authority, earned through years of integrity, the ability to see what truly matters. These become crucial when preserving something precious for future generations. He could have said, "I'm old. I've practiced hard my whole life. Let someone younger take this on." He could have retreated to solitary meditation, focusing solely on his own liberation, leaving the mess of organizing and preservation to others. But he saw that his responsibility didn't end with his own practice, that being part of a spiritual community means serving that community, especially at crucial moments when the stakes are high. The first council succeeded in its purpose. The teachings and the discipline were preserved with remarkable accuracy, passed on orally at first, with elaborate systems to ensure fidelity, and eventually written down centuries later in a form that would reach practitioners 2,000 years in the future. None of this would have happened without Mahakassapa's leadership, without his willingness to step into responsibility at a time when he could have stepped back. The robe exchange that had happened years earlier now took on even deeper meaning. When Mahakassapa had offered his better robe to the aging Buddha, he had been practicing a kind of caring attention, a recognition that the teacher's physical needs mattered, that supporting the Dharma meant supporting the person who embodied it. Now, wearing the Buddha's old robe, leading the effort to preserve what the Buddha had taught, Mahakassapa was demonstrating the full circle of that exchange. The transmission was complete, not in the sense that Mahakassapa had become the Buddha or replaced him, but in the sense that the responsibility for carrying the teachings forward had been accepted and fulfilled. The robe became a symbol of that transmission, of the continuity between teacher and student, between one generation and the next, between the physical person of the Buddha and the eternal Dharma that he had realized and taught. What this story offers us is a vision of aging that's neither about decline nor about clinging to youthful capabilities. It's about recognizing how purpose transforms as we age, how the contributions we can make shift but don't diminish, how our role in community evolves but remains essential. Mahakassapa couldn't have organized the first council when he was younger. He wouldn't have had the authority, the perspective, the wisdom that came from decades of practice. His age, his experience, his years of respected integrity, these were exactly what the situation required. The young monks could memorize and recite, but it took an elder to hold the space, to maintain the discipline, to make the difficult decisions about what to include and how to organize it. This is what becomes possible when we don't resist aging, when we don't try to keep doing at 70 what we did at 30, but instead ask what this time of life makes possible that wasn't possible before. Mahakassapa couldn't walk as far or practice as intensely as he once had. The records suggest he eventually had to relax some of his austere practices due to his body's limitations. But he could do something far more important. He could ensure that the teachings would survive, that the Dharma would reach beings not yet born, that the Buddha's realization wouldn't die with the Buddha's body. The story also shows us something about the nature of spiritual community, about how practitioners support each other across the generations. The younger monks provided the energy and the detailed memory. The elder monks provided the wisdom and the leadership. Everyone had a role. Everyone's contribution mattered, and the work succeeded because people were willing to step into what was needed rather than holding back or competing for status. In the end, Mahakassapa's greatest contribution wasn't his personal austerity or his individual attainment, remarkable as those were. His greatest contribution was his willingness to serve the Dharma in whatever way the moment required, whether that meant offering a robe to an aging teacher, organizing 500 monks to preserve teachings, or using his elder authority to ensure those teachings reach the future. This is what wisdom in action looks like, and it's a possibility that remains available at any age, in any circumstance, for anyone willing to see what's needed and respond with their whole heart. Most people know the story of Kisagotami and the mustard seed, how she came to the Buddha wild with grief after her infant son died, how she begged him to bring the child back to life, how he sent her to find mustard seed from a house untouched by death, how she discovered through that impossible search that death visits every home, every family, and how that discovery transformed her understanding of loss. But that's only the beginning of Kisagotami's story, not the end. What happened to her after that moment of realization, after she cremated her son's body and returned to the Buddha to formally join his community of practitioners? Where did her path lead over the following years and decades? This second part of her story is less famous, but perhaps more instructive for those of us trying to understand what aging can offer, what purpose can look like in later life. After that devastating experience of losing her child, Kisagotami, ordained as a nun, she threw herself into practice with the intensity of someone who had seen directly into the nature of suffering and was determined to find lasting freedom from it. She meditated for hours, studied the teachings carefully, and gradually developed a clarity about impermanence that went far deeper than intellectual understanding. It wasn't just that she knew things changed. She could see change happening moment by moment in her own experience, and that seeing brought a peace that had eluded her when she was still fighting against reality. The years passed. Kisagotami's hair, which had been black when she first came to the Buddha in her grief, began to show grey. The lines on her face deepened. Her body, which had been young and strong when she lost her son, began to show the effects of time and the austere lifestyle of a wandering nun. But something else was happening alongside these physical changes. She was becoming someone the younger nuns turned to for guidance, someone whose presence carried a quality of hard-won wisdom that couldn't be faked or imitated. She became what was called an elder nun, not just someone who was old in years, but someone whose understanding and compassion had matured to the point where she could hold space for others' suffering without being overwhelmed by it, could offer guidance without imposing her own agenda, could see clearly enough to know what someone actually needed to hear, rather than what they wanted to hear. And here's what became Kisagotami's particular gift to the community. She could help grieving mothers in a way no one else could. When a woman would come to the monastery gates, eyes red from crying, carrying the body of a dead child, or devastated by the loss of a husband or parent, the other nuns would often bring her to Kisagotami. Not because Kisagotami had any magic words or special techniques, but because she had been exactly where they were. She knew the geography of that particular hell, had walked every inch of it herself, and had found a way through to the other side. When a grieving mother sat across from Kisagotami and saw her grey hair, her aging face, her weathered hands, something would shift. This wasn't some young teacher offering theories about impermanence from books. This was someone whose body itself testified to the passage of time, whose presence confirmed that it's possible to survive what feels unsurvivable, whose very existence proved that life continues, even after the worst loss imaginable. Kisagotami would often begin by simply listening. She would let the mother tell her story, the details of the child's life, the circumstances of the death, the unbearable weight of the loss. She wouldn't rush to offer comfort or teaching. She would just be present with the pain, recognizing it, acknowledging it, making space for it, without trying to fix it or make it go away prematurely. Then, when the time was right, she would share her own story, not as a formula or a prescription, but as a simple offering of what she had experienced and what she had learned. She would describe her own son, her own overwhelming grief, her own desperate search for someone who could undo what had happened. And she would describe what the Buddha's teaching had revealed to her, not that the pain wasn't real, not that the loss didn't matter, but that suffering comes from how we relate to that pain, from the ways we resist what has already happened. She would point to her own aging body as part of the teaching. "Look at these grey hairs," she might say. "My son never got grey hair. He never got to grow old, never got to experience what I'm experiencing now. My body shows the passage of time, shows that I continued living after he died, shows that grief doesn't actually kill us, even when we think it will." This wasn't meant to minimize anyone's pain or to suggest they should just get over it. It was meant to show that the body ages whether we're grieving or not, that time continues whether we're ready for it or not, that life has a forward momentum that carries us along even when we think we can't go on. Kisagotami's aging itself became evidence that healing is possible, that we're more resilient than we realize, that the future we can't imagine when we're in the depths of loss actually does arrive. She would teach the younger nuns about impermanence, not as an abstract concept, but as a lived reality. "Everything that comes together will come apart," she would say. "Every meeting ends in separation. Every birth ends in death. This is not a punishment or a flaw in the universe. It's simply how things are. When we fight against this truth, we suffer. When we accept it, we can still feel sadness, still feel loss, but we don't add the extra layer of suffering that comes from thinking things should be different than they are." What made Kisagotami's teaching so powerful was the combination of her direct experience and her decades of practice since that experience. She wasn't speaking from fresh grief. She was speaking from the perspective of someone who had integrated that grief, learned from it, been transformed by it, and now had enough distance to see what had actually helped and what had only prolonged the suffering. Young teachers, no matter how intellectually brilliant or technically skilled, can't offer what an elder like Kisagotami could offer. They haven't lived long enough to see the full arc of grief, haven't experienced how wounds that seem permanent eventually shift and change, haven't watched their own bodies age and understood viscerally what impermanence means. Kisagotami's grey hair, her wrinkled hands, her aging body, these weren't obstacles to her teaching. They were credentials, proof that she had survived what she was helping others survive. She would sometimes tell the younger nuns, "My body is my teaching tool now. Every wrinkle is a reminder that time passes. Every grey hair is proof that we change. Every ache and pain is an opportunity to practice not identifying with this temporary form. I used to think my body was me, that when it was young and strong, that meant I was young and strong, that when my son died, part of me died too. But the body keeps changing, and what I actually am, this awareness, this capacity to know and respond and care, that hasn't died, hasn't aged in the way the body has aged." This was a profound teaching about the relationship between aging and wisdom. The body does age. There's no avoiding that. But the wisdom, the compassion, the clarity of seeing, these can actually deepen and strengthen as the body weakens. Kisagotami in her elder years was far more useful to the community than she had been as a younger nun, not despite her age, but because of it. The grieving mothers who came to see her didn't need someone who looked like everything was perfect and easy. They needed someone who looked like life had been hard, who showed signs of having weathered storms, who radiated a kind of peace that clearly hadn't come from avoiding difficulty, but from moving through it with awareness and courage. Kisagotami would often say to them, "Your child's death taught you something about impermanence that no book or lecture could teach. It's a terrible way to learn, a way none of us would choose, but the learning is real. Now you have a choice. You can let this experience destroy you, or you can let it open you to a deeper understanding of how life actually works. You can spend the rest of your life fighting against the fact that your child died, or you can learn to carry that loss in a way that doesn't poison your entire existence." This kind of direct, even blunt teaching only worked because of who it came from. A young teacher saying these things might seem callous or insensitive, but coming from Kisagotami, who had walked this exact path, who had felt this exact pain, who had found her way to genuine peace, not by bypassing grief, but by moving completely through it, coming from her, these words landed as permission, as possibility, as a map through territory that seemed impossible to navigate. She would also teach about the importance of service, of taking our suffering and transforming it into medicine for others. When I was young and my son died, I thought I was the only one who had ever experienced such pain, she would tell the younger nuns. But the Buddha sent me out to find a house untouched by death, and I discovered that loss is universal, that everyone has lost someone, that grief visits every home. Now my purpose is to be for others what the Buddha was for me, not someone who takes away the pain, because that's impossible, but someone who helps others see clearly what's actually happening, who helps them find a path through the pain that doesn't create additional, unnecessary suffering. This transformation, from someone drowning in personal grief to someone who could help others navigate their own grief, this is what aging made possible for Kisagotami. She needed the years to integrate her experience, to practice with it, to develop the clarity and compassion that would make her an effective teacher. She needed the grey hair and the wrinkles and the aging body to have the authority and credibility that made people trust her guidance. There's a particular quality that comes from elder teachers who have genuinely worked with their own suffering, a groundedness, a lack of pretense, a willingness to acknowledge difficulty without dramatizing it. Kisagotami embodied this quality. She didn't present herself as someone who had transcended grief or become immune to sadness. She presented herself as someone who had learned to meet these experiences with awareness rather than resistance, and that learning had brought a freedom that didn't depend on circumstances being a particular way. Young nuns would seek her out not just when they were grieving, but when they were struggling with any kind of loss, the loss of relationships, the loss of youth, the loss of health, the loss of the future they had imagined for themselves. They recognized that Kisagotami understood something essential about letting go, about working with the pain of change, about finding peace in a world where nothing stays the same. And Kisagotami would meet them with the same quality of attention she had received from the Buddha all those years ago, a presence that didn't judge, didn't rush to fix, didn't offer false comfort, but instead helped them see clearly what was actually happening and what was possible in response to it. In her final years, Kisagotami's body became quite frail. She could no longer travel as she once had, could no longer sit for hours in meditation without discomfort, could no longer do many of the things that had once been central to her practice. But her usefulness to the community, her ability to serve others, remained undiminished. In fact, it increased, because now she could also teach about this final stage of aging, about meeting physical decline with the same awareness and acceptance she had brought to everything else. She would say to the younger nuns, "Watch my body carefully. See how it weakens, how it becomes less reliable, how it moves toward death. This is everyone's future if you live long enough. Better to see it clearly now in my body than to be shocked when it happens in your own. And notice also that as this body ages and weakens, the peace I've found doesn't depend on the body's condition. That peace comes from seeing clearly, from not grasping, from understanding that this body was never mine to keep in the first place." This is what becomes possible when we don't resist aging, when we allow ourselves to become elders in the true sense, not just people who are old, but people whose accumulated experience and hard-won wisdom become resources for the community. Kisagotami couldn't have done this work when she was young. She needed the grief, the years of practice, the aging process itself to develop into someone who could hold space for others' pain and help them find their way through it. Her story shows us that suffering doesn't have to be wasted, that the most difficult experiences in our lives can become the foundation for how we serve others later, that aging can mean not a loss of purpose, but a transformation of purpose into something deeper and more meaningful than what was possible in youth. The grey-haired elder nun who sat with grieving mothers, whose aging body testified to the passage of time and the possibility of survival, who transformed her own loss into medicine for others. This was Kisagotami's true gift, and it could only have come with age. Mahapajapati was the Buddha's maternal aunt, and after his mother died shortly after his birth, it was Pajapati who raised him as her own child. This connection alone would have made her significant in Buddhist history, but what made her truly remarkable was what she did decades later when her nephew became the Buddha and began teaching a path to liberation. After the Buddha's father died, Pajapati approached her nephew with an extraordinary request. She wanted to join his community of monks as a practitioner. This had never been done before. The Buddha's community consisted entirely of men, and the idea of women renouncing household life to practice full-time was unprecedented in that culture and time. The Buddha initially refused, not once, but 3 times. Whether this was because he genuinely believed women couldn't practice at the same level as men, or because he understood the social complications that would arise, or because he wanted Pajapati to demonstrate the depth of her commitment, the texts don't make this entirely clear. What is clear is that Pajapati didn't give up. She shaved her own head, put on monk's robes, and walked hundreds of miles with a group of other women who wanted to practice, arriving at the monastery with bleeding feet, exhausted and covered in dust. When the Buddha's attendant Ananda saw her condition and heard her story, he intervened on her behalf, asking the Buddha directly whether women were capable of achieving the same liberation as men. The Buddha's answer was unequivocal. Yes, women were equally capable of full awakening. With that acknowledgement, he agreed to ordain Pajapati and the women with her, creating the order of nuns and making Pajapati the first fully ordained Buddhist nun. She was already middle-aged by this point, perhaps in her 50s, an age when most people in that era were considering themselves quite old. But Pajapati's story was just beginning. She threw herself into practice with an intensity that surprised even the Buddha's most dedicated male disciples. She studied the teachings thoroughly, meditated with complete focus, and gradually became not just accomplished in her own practice, but a skilled teacher and leader of the growing community of nuns. Other women looked to her for guidance, and she developed a reputation for combining deep wisdom with practical common sense about how to navigate the challenges of renunciant life. The years passed, then decades. Pajapati continued practicing, continued teaching, continued leading the community of nuns through various challenges and changes. And then she reached an age that by ancient standards was absolutely extraordinary. She entered her 80s. To understand how remarkable this was, you need to know that in ancient India, the average lifespan was perhaps 35 to 40 years. Someone in their 60s was considered very old. Someone in their 80s was almost unheard of. And if they did reach that age, they were typically frail, inactive, focused on preparing for death rather than on any kind of vigorous activity. But Mahapajapati at 80 was not spending her days resting or preparing to die. She was still practicing intensely, still taking on difficult austerities, still pushing herself in meditation and discipline in ways that made even the younger nuns uncomfortable to watch. The younger nuns would see her attempting practices that were challenging even for them, long hours of sitting meditation despite the pain it caused her aged joints, periods of fasting despite her body's need for nourishment, minimal sleep despite her body's need for rest. They worried about her. They tried to convince her to take it easier, to acknowledge her age, to rest more and push less. Pajapati's response became famous in the community. She would say, "This body ages. I can see that clearly. My joints are stiff. My skin is wrinkled. My hair is white. My energy is not what it once was. But my effort does not age. My determination to practice, my commitment to awakening, my willingness to meet difficulty, these have not diminished with the body's diminishment. Why would I stop practicing intensely now, when death may come at any moment? Why would I waste whatever time remains?" This was a radically different approach to aging than what we typically see. Most people, as they age, naturally pull back from intensity, reduce their ambitions, lower their expectations of themselves. There's nothing wrong with this. It can be wise to adjust your activities to match your body's changing capabilities. But Pajapati was making a distinction that's easy to miss. She wasn't denying that her body had limitations. She wasn't pretending she could do everything she could do at 30 or 50. She was saying that the physical body's capacity and the mind's determination are two different things, and that the second doesn't have to decline just because the first does. When she sat in meditation and her knees screamed in protest, she didn't get up and walk away. She observed the pain with the same clarity she had cultivated over decades of practice, seeing it as sensation rather than as my pain, as information rather than as a command to stop. She knew the difference between pain that signals actual harm and pain that's just discomfort, and she was willing to sit with discomfort in service of deeper understanding. When she fasted and her stomach clenched with hunger, she didn't immediately seek food. She investigated the hunger, watched how it arose and intensified, and eventually passed, used it as a teaching about the impermanent nature of all sensations, all desires, all experiences. She wasn't torturing herself. She was using the body's responses as objects of meditation, as opportunities to see clearly how identification with bodily states creates suffering. The younger nuns couldn't always understand this distinction. They saw an 80-year-old woman pushing herself hard and worried she was being reckless or stubborn or unable to accept her limitations. But Pajapati was demonstrating something crucial, that spiritual practice doesn't require a young, strong body, that determination and clarity can actually deepen as the body weakens, that advanced age is not a disqualification from intensive practice, but potentially an advantage. How is old age an advantage for practice? Because when you're young, it's easy to believe you have unlimited time, easy to procrastinate on the things that truly matter, easy to get distracted by all the possibilities and options that seem to stretch endlessly before you. But when you're 80, in a time when most people died decades earlier, when you can feel in your bones that death is approaching, that creates a clarity of purpose, an urgency, a cutting away of everything non-essential. Pajapati would tell the younger nuns, "You think you have time to waste, time to be lazy, time to put off serious practice until you're more ready or the conditions are more favorable. But look at me. I'm 80 years old and death could come today or tomorrow or next week. Do you think I'm going to spend whatever time remains watching my mind wander or indulging in comfort? Every moment might be my last chance to see clearly, to let go more completely, to understand more deeply." This creates a kind of focus that younger practitioners often lack. She wasn't saying this to make them feel guilty or inadequate. She was trying to wake them up to the reality of impermanence, to help them understand that youth and health are not guarantees of future opportunity, that the time to practice seriously is always now, because the future is never certain. As Pajapati moved deeper into her 80s, and then, according to some accounts, into her 90s and beyond, she achieved levels of concentration and insight that even the most accomplished younger practitioners marveled at. She developed what in Buddhist terms are called the spiritual powers, abilities that arise from extremely refined states of concentration and are considered signs of advanced attainment rather than goals in themselves. These powers include things like knowing others' minds, remembering past lives, seeing beings in other realms, and in some cases, demonstrating control over the physical elements in ways that seem impossible according to ordinary understanding of how bodies and physics work. Whether you interpret these powers literally or metaphorically, they represented something real about Pajapati's level of accomplishment. She had mastered her mind to a degree that most practitioners never reach. When Pajapati knew her death was approaching, and according to the texts, she knew this with certainty, just as she had known everything else with clarity, she made a decision. She would demonstrate these powers publicly before she died, not to show off or to prove anything about herself, but to teach one final lesson to the community of nuns and monks who would remain after she was gone. The texts describe her rising into the air, displaying various miraculous abilities, making fire and water appear from her body simultaneously, walking through walls and the earth as if they were empty space. If this sounds impossible or fantastical, consider what she was really demonstrating: that the aged body, the body that everyone assumed was limited and weak, could become a vehicle for displaying the fruits of decades of intensive mental training. The message was clear: don't assume that physical aging means spiritual capacity is diminished. Don't write off the elderly as past their prime or incapable of achievement. Don't let your own aging become an excuse for giving up on serious practice. The body ages, weakens, eventually dies, but the mind's potential for clarity, for concentration, for profound realization does not age in the same way. After demonstrating these powers, Pajapati returned to her sitting place, settled into meditation, and died. Not from illness, not from accident, not from her body simply giving out, but from a conscious decision to let go of this life, to release her hold on this temporary collection of elements that had served its purpose. She died in perfect mindfulness, completely aware of every aspect of the dying process, demonstrating that death too could be met with clarity rather than fear or confusion. Some accounts say she lived to be 120 years old, which, if true, would have been essentially unheard of in that time and place. Whether that specific number is accurate or symbolic, the point is that she lived to a very advanced age and remained actively engaged in intensive practice right up until her final moment. Her final teaching to the community was simple and direct: don't waste time thinking you're too old to practice seriously. Don't use age as an excuse for spiritual laziness. The body will age whether you practice or not, whether you achieve liberation or not. But how you use whatever time remains, how present you are with whatever is happening in your body and mind, how deeply you investigate the nature of experience, these are choices available at any age. This teaching challenges several common assumptions about aging. We often think that serious spiritual practice is something for young people, that older people should focus on comfort and ease, that pushing yourself hard is inappropriate past a certain age. But Pajapati showed that the opposite can be true, that the urgency created by approaching death, the clarity that comes from decades of practice, and the freedom from many of the distractions and ambitions that occupy younger people, can all make elderhood an ideal time for deep practice. She also challenged the assumption that women, especially older women, are somehow less capable of spiritual attainment than men. Remember that she had to fight just to be allowed to ordain, that the Buddha initially resisted creating an order of nuns, that the culture of her time viewed women as spiritually inferior. By achieving the highest levels of realization and by demonstrating extraordinary powers at an advanced age, she demolished these assumptions completely. What Pajapati offers us is not a prescription that everyone should practice as intensely as she did at whatever age. Different people have different capacities, different circumstances, different paths. What she offers is the understanding that aging doesn't automatically mean decreased capacity for practice, that determination and effort are qualities of mind rather than qualities of youth, and that the relationship between physical condition and spiritual potential is more complex and fluid than we typically assume. Her example invites us to question our own assumptions about what's possible at different life stages. When we catch ourselves thinking, "I'm too old for this," or "that's for younger people," or "at my age I should be taking it easy," we might pause and ask, is this actually true? Is the body truly incapable? Or is the mind making assumptions? Am I respecting genuine limitations? Or am I using age as a convenient excuse to avoid effort or challenge? Sometimes the answer will be that yes, you genuinely need to modify your practice, need to work within actual physical limitations, need to be kinder and gentler with an aging body. That's wise and appropriate. But sometimes the answer will be that you're capable of more than you've been giving yourself credit for, that your mind has been telling you stories about decline that aren't entirely accurate, that the determination to practice deeply is still available if you're willing to access it. Mahapajapati's life spanned more than a century, in a time when that was almost miraculous. She went from being the Buddha's aunt to being the first nun, to being the leader of an entire community of women practitioners, to being a very old woman who still practiced with the intensity of someone half her age. Her final demonstration of powers and her conscious, mindful death served as a culminating teaching that the body ages and dies. This is inevitable, but how we meet that aging and dying, how present we remain, how deeply we practice with whatever time we have, this is up to us at any age. The younger nuns who witnessed her final teachings and her death carried those lessons forward. They remembered her saying, "This body ages, but my effort does not age." And when they themselves grew old, some of them took those words to heart, refusing to use age as an excuse for diminished practice. Instead, meeting their own aging with the same determination and clarity that Pajapati had modeled. And that's perhaps the deepest gift an elder can give to those who come after, not a formula to follow exactly, but an example that expands what we think is possible, that challenges our limiting assumptions. That shows us that the human spirit's capacity for awakening, for presence, for profound realization, doesn't necessarily diminish just because the body does. Mahapajapati lived and died as proof of this truth, and her teaching echoes across the centuries to anyone willing to question whether age must mean the end of serious practice rather than potentially its deepening. There was a merchant in the city of Savatthi named Anathapindika, which means feeder of the poor, and he had earned that name through decades of extraordinary generosity. He was wealthy, having built a successful trading business, but unlike many wealthy people, he understood that money was only useful to the extent it could relieve suffering and support what was truly valuable. When Anathapindika first encountered the Buddha's teachings, something in him recognized immediately that this was what he had been searching for without knowing it. He became one of the Buddha's most devoted lay supporters, eventually purchasing an entire park with gold coins to donate to the community as a monastery. The story goes that he literally covered the ground with gold pieces laid side by side to pay the owner's asking price. So determined was he to provide a suitable place for the Buddha and his monks to teach and practice. That park became known as Jetavana Monastery, and it was there that the Buddha gave many of his most important teachings over the following years. Anathapindika would visit regularly, bringing food and supplies for the community, sitting in on teachings when his business allowed, practicing meditation and ethical conduct as best he could, while still managing his household and his work. He was what we might call a serious practitioner who happened to have a family and a career, rather than a casual dabbler who showed up only when convenient. But now Anathapindika was old, and he was dying. The illness had come on gradually at first. Then, with increasing severity, he could feel his body failing in ways that no medicine could reverse. No treatment could halt. The pain was significant, not constant, but coming in waves that left him breathless and exhausted. Worse than the physical pain was the fear, the sense of approaching an edge beyond which he couldn't see, couldn't know, couldn't control anything. He had practiced for years, had heard countless teachings about impermanence and letting go, had intellectually understood that death was inevitable and that clinging to life only created suffering. But now, lying on his sickbed with death, approaching not as an abstract concept, but as an immediate reality, he found that intellectual understanding wasn't enough. His mind kept grasping, kept reaching for life, kept trying to bargain with reality for just a little more time. Someone in the household sent word to the monastery that Anathapindika was gravely ill, and two of the Buddha's senior disciples, Sariputta and Ananda, decided to visit him. Sariputta was known for his wisdom and his skill in teaching, while Ananda was the Buddha's personal attendant and had a reputation for deep compassion. Together, they made their way to Anathapindika's house, where they were shown to his room. When they entered, they found Anathapindika lying on his bed, his face showing the strain of pain and fear. He greeted them with obvious relief. These were not just casual visitors, but people who understood the Dharma, who might be able to help him navigate what was happening. Sariputta sat down beside the bed and asked Anathapindika how he was doing, and Anathapindika didn't try to minimize his situation. He described the pain, how it would surge and recede, but never fully go away. He described his fear of death, his difficulty accepting that he was about to lose everything, his life, his family, his possessions, his very sense of being someone. He described how hard it was to let go, even though he knew intellectually that he had no choice. Sariputta listened carefully, and then he began to teach in a way that was both gentle and completely direct. What he offered wasn't comfort or reassurance or promises that everything would be okay. What he offered was a practice, a way of working with exactly what Anathapindika was experiencing in this moment of approaching death. Anathapindika, Sariputta began, you should train yourself in this way. With your eyes, when you see forms, colors, shapes, light, darkness, you should recognize, this seeing is not mine. I am not this seeing. This seeing is not myself. With your ears, when you hear sounds, voices, music, silence, noise, you should recognize, this hearing is not mine. I am not this hearing. This hearing is not myself. He continued systematically through all 6 sense bases that Buddhism identifies: eyes and visible forms, ears and sounds, nose and smells, tongue and tastes, body and physical sensations, mind and mental objects. For each one, the same instruction. Recognize that this is not mine. I am not this. This is not myself. Then he went deeper, applying the same contemplation to the body itself. Consider your head. This head is not mine. I am not this head. This head is not myself. Consider your hands, your chest, your legs, your internal organs. Each part of this body is not mine. I am not these body parts. These body parts are not myself. This entire physical form that you've identified with your whole life, it is not yours. You are not it. It is not yourself. He continued with feelings, pleasant, unpleasant, and neutral sensations. The pain you're experiencing right now, this pain is not yours. You are not this pain. This pain is not yourself. The fear you're feeling, this fear is not yours. You are not this fear. This fear is not yourself. Then, perceptions, mental formations, consciousness itself, everything that makes up what we call a person, Sariputta, guided Anathapindika to examine and release identification with each aspect. Even this consciousness that knows these experiences, this consciousness is not yours. You are not this consciousness. This consciousness is not yourself. As Sariputta spoke, something remarkable began to happen. Anathapindika started to cry, not from pain or fear, but from a strange mixture of relief and recognition. Tears ran down his face as he listened to these instructions, and after Sariputta finished, Anathapindika could barely speak through his emotion. Venerable Sariputta, he finally said, his voice shaking, I have been a supporter of the Buddha's community for decades. I've attended countless teachings. I've listened to the Buddha himself speak many times. I've heard many learned monks explain the Dharma, but never, in all those years, have I heard a teaching this profound, this direct, this helpful for what I'm facing right now. There was almost a note of complaint in his voice, mixed with the gratitude. Why had no one taught him this before? Why had he spent years hearing teachings that now seemed superficial compared to what he desperately needed as death approached? Sariputta's response was honest and revealing. We generally don't teach this deeply to lay people, anathapindika. We tend to give householders more basic teachings about generosity, about ethical conduct, about the benefits of meditation. These deeper teachings about not self, about releasing identification with all aspects of experience. We usually reserve these for monks and nuns who have given up household life and can dedicate themselves fully to practice. Anathapindika's response came with surprising force considering his weakened condition. Please, Venerable Sir, don't do that. Don't withhold these teachings from lay people. We need them too. We need them especially when we're facing death, when all the surface level understanding isn't enough, when we're struggling to let go of everything we've held onto our entire lives. He continued, speaking urgently despite his exhaustion. There are lay people of great wisdom, of mature understanding, who are capable of grasping these deeper teachings and putting them into practice. Don't assume that because someone has a family or a business that they can't handle the profound Dharma. Teach us these things. We're dying too, just like the monks, just like everyone. We need tools to work with that reality. What Anathapindika was expressing in this moment went beyond his personal situation. He was speaking for all the lay practitioners who had received teaching suitable for living a good life, but not deep enough to prepare them for death, who had been treated as less capable of profound understanding simply because they hadn't renounced household life. Sariputta took Anathapindika's plea seriously. He assured him that he would share this feedback, would encourage other teachers to offer these deeper teachings to capable lay people, would help ensure that householders weren't systematically excluded from the most liberating aspects of the Dharma. But more importantly, Sariputta continued to work with Anathapindika right there in that moment, helping him apply the teaching to his immediate experience. Right now, as you lie here in pain and fear, practice what I've taught you. When pain arises, instead of contracting around it and thinking, I am in pain, I am suffering, simply observe. There is pain, there is unpleasant sensation, and this sensation is not mine. I am not this sensation. This sensation is not myself. When fear arises about death, about what will happen, about losing everything, instead of identifying with that fear, recognize it as just another mental formation arising due to conditions. This fear is not yours to keep. You are not this fear. This fear is not yourself. It arises. It exists for a time. It will pass away, just like everything else. Anathapindika practiced with this instruction right there in his sickbed, and something shifted in his experience. The pain didn't disappear. It remained as intense as before, but his relationship to the pain changed. Instead of being someone who was in pain, someone who was suffering, there was simply pain occurring, simply unpleasant sensation being known by awareness, and that awareness itself wasn't in pain, wasn't suffering, was spacious enough to hold the pain without being overwhelmed by it. The fear of death similarly transformed. It didn't vanish completely, but it loosened its grip. Death was still approaching. The body was still dying. But who or what was dying? This body that was not his, this consciousness that was not him, this collection of elements that had never been a fixed self in the first place, all of it was simply dissolving according to natural law, and there was nothing to protect, nothing to defend, nothing that needed to be held onto, because nothing had ever been his to keep. Sariputta and Ananda stayed for some time, making sure Anathapindika understood the practice clearly, answering his questions, supporting him as he worked with these instructions in real time. When they finally left, Anathapindika was calm, not because he wasn't dying anymore, but because he had found a way to meet death without adding layers of mental suffering on top of the physical reality. According to the texts, Anathapindika died soon after this teaching, possibly that same day, or within a few days. But he died differently than he would have died without this final teaching from Sariputta. He died with understanding, with the ability to release his grip on life, with a clarity about what was happening that transformed death from a terrifying unknown into simply the next moment of experience, no more and no less. This story challenges several assumptions we often have about death and dying. First, it challenges the idea that we shouldn't talk about death with dying people, that bringing up death or teaching about letting go is somehow morbid or depressing. Anathapindika experienced Sariputta's teaching not as morbid, but as merciful, as exactly what he needed most in his final hours. Second, it challenges the assumption that people facing death need comfort and reassurance rather than clear teaching. Sariputta didn't tell Anathapindika that everything would be okay, didn't promise him a pleasant afterlife, didn't try to distract him from his fear. Instead, he gave him a practice, a way of working directly with his experience that could transform suffering from the inside out. Third, it challenges the idea that death contemplation is a practice for experts or for people who are morbidly obsessed with mortality. Anathapindika was a successful businessman, a householder with family and responsibilities, someone fully engaged with life. But when death came, his years of Dharma study and practice still left him struggling until someone taught him how to work with death directly, how to release identification with what was dissolving. The practice Sariputta taught, going through each sense door, each body part, each aspect of experience, and recognizing, this is not mine, I am not this is not myself, this is not just for dying people. It's a practice we can do right now, at any time, whether we're healthy or sick, young or old. Every moment, we have the opportunity to notice where we're grasping, where we're identifying with experience as if it were a solid self, and to practice releasing that identification. When you feel pain, you can practice observing it as sensation rather than as my pain. When you feel fear, you can recognize it as a temporary mental formation rather than as I am afraid. When you look at your body in the mirror, you can practice seeing it as a collection of borrowed elements rather than as me. This isn't about denying conventional reality or pretending you don't exist. It's about loosening the tight grip of identification that creates so much suffering. Anathapindika's tears of relief when he heard this teaching point to something important. When we finally hear a truth we've been needing to hear, when someone offers us a tool we've been desperately searching for, when we encounter teaching that meets us exactly where we are and shows us a way forward, there's often an emotional release, a sense of, yes, finally, this is what I needed. His plea to Sariputta not to withhold these teachings from lay people also carries an important message. Sometimes teachers or communities create unnecessary hierarchies, assuming that certain people can handle deep teachings while others need to be protected from them or aren't ready for them. But suffering is democratic. It doesn't respect the boundaries between monastics and lay people, between experts and beginners, and the teachings that truly liberate need to be available to everyone who's ready to receive them, regardless of their life circumstances. What Anathapindika demonstrates in his final hours is that it's never too late to learn, never too late to practice, never too late to transform your relationship with what's happening. Even lying on a deathbed in pain and fear, there's still the possibility of working with experience in a way that reduces suffering, that creates space, that allows for letting go. The contemplation of death that Sariputta taught is sometimes called death awareness practice, and it's considered one of the most powerful practices in Buddhism, precisely because it cuts through all the ways we fool ourselves about what's actually happening. When you truly contemplate that this body will die, that consciousness will cease, that everything you're holding on to will be lost, not someday in the distant future, but potentially today, potentially this moment. It creates a clarity about what actually matters, about how to spend the time you have, about what's worth grasping and what can be released. Anathapindika had lived a good life, generous, ethical, devoted to supporting the Dharma, but none of that automatically translated into being able to face death with equanimity. He needed specific instruction, practical guidance on how to work with the experience of dying. And when he received that instruction, even in his final hours, it was enough to transform his death from a struggle into a release. This is what becomes possible when teaching meets readiness, when someone is willing to practice, even in the midst of difficulty, when the Dharma is offered not as abstract philosophy, but as practical tools for working with whatever life or death brings. Anathapindika died as he had lived, with dedication to the Dharma, but his final teaching from Sariputta gave him something his years of practice hadn't yet provided, a way to let go completely. Not mine, not me, not myself, all the way to the end and beyond. These 7 practitioners discovered something that transforms how we age, that the body's decline and the spirit's awakening can happen simultaneously. They show us aging not as tragedy, but as ripening, not as loss, but as finally seeing what matters. Nakulapita learned his afflicted body need not afflict his mind. Ambapali watched beauty fade while wisdom grew, using her aging form as proof of impermanence. The Pang family met death with such freedom they could even laugh at its approach. Mahakassapa discovered that elder years bring responsibilities youth cannot fulfill. Kissagatami transformed personal grief into medicine for countless others. Mahapajapati practiced intensely at 80, proving spiritual determination doesn't age. And Anathapindika found liberation in his final hours through teachings he'd needed all along. Each of them faced what you're facing or will face: bodies weakening, roles changing, death approaching. But they faced these truths with awareness rather than resistance, with presence rather than denial. And in that clear seeing, they found something unexpected. Not the absence of pain or change, but freedom from suffering about pain and change. The Buddha taught that all conditioned things are impermanent, that clinging to what cannot be kept creates suffering, that liberation comes through seeing clearly and letting go. These practitioners didn't just believe these teachings, they lived them, especially in their elder years, when the truth of impermanence becomes undeniable. You have this same capacity. Your aging body can become your teacher. Your remaining years can deepen into wisdom. Your purpose can transform rather than disappear. This is what becomes possible when we stop fighting what is and start practicing with what's actually here. May you find this freedom. May you age with clarity. May you discover that peace doesn't require a young body, only a present mind.